Look at the trillion-dollar hardware and software empires spanning the San Francisco Bay Area today, and it is almost impossible to imagine what occupied this exact same real estate back in the 1940s. Before the venture capital firms and corporate campuses moved in, the southern end of the bay was almost entirely agrarian. Locals called it the Valley of Heart's Delight, a region defined by fruit orchards, dairy farms, and canning factories. If you had a brilliant idea for a new piece of electronics back then, you faced a massive structural problem. Traditional banks operated on physical collateral. They would loan money for a tractor, but they refused to provide risk capital for unproven, small-scale technological theories. Because of this financial vacuum, highly specialized engineers had very few options. To get the funding required to actually build complex hardware, they had to work within giant, slow-moving corporate monopolies or highly classified government defense projects. The region possessed the intellect to build revolutionary technology, but the financial mechanisms required to commercialize those ideas independently simply did not exist. Stanford University engineering professor Fred Terman recognized this bottleneck. He wanted to halt the brain drain of local talent moving to the East Coast and move the local economy away from agriculture. Terman established the Stanford Industrial Park, offering university land to technology companies. More importantly, he pushed his own students to stay local and build independent businesses, encouraging William Hewlett and David Packard to commercialize their engineering work out of a nearby garage. This setup created an academic-industrial feedback loop. By locating their businesses right next to the university, these young tech companies secured a direct, continuous pipeline of raw engineering talent straight out of Stanford's classrooms. Terman had successfully cultivated fertile ground for technological development, yet the ecosystem remained largely dormant, waiting for a specific catalyst to ignite it. That catalyst arrived in the form of William Shockley. He was a brilliant physicist and co-inventor of the transistor, who moved west to launch his own semiconductor lab. Shockley managed to recruit some of the sharpest young PhDs in the country, but his management style was disastrous. He isolated his researchers into secret projects, recorded employee phone calls, and even demanded his own scientists submit to polygraph tests. By the summer of 1957, his top researchers reached their breaking point. 8 of his leading scientists, a group that would soon be known as the Traitorous Eight, decided to defect and build their own company. Shockley's toxic management created an unintended crisis for his defecting team. They have the expertise to build advanced silicon transistors, but they were suddenly unemployed and urgently needed independent startup capital to survive. The solution to their problem was quietly taking shape on the East Coast. A French émigré and Harvard Business School professor named Georges Doriot had recently formed the American Research and Development Corporation. This illustrates Doriot's radical, long-tail investment logic. Instead of demanding safe returns like a traditional bank, ARD intentionally absorbed the losses of dozens of failed startups, knowing those losses would be completely offset by the returns of a few exceptional hits. Doriot proved this high-risk model worked in 1957. ARD provided capital to an unproven computer startup called Digital Equipment Corporation. That single investment in the PDP-8 minicomputer eventually returned hundreds of millions of dollars. Recognizing the power of this strategy, a young financier named Arthur Rock applied this East Coast venture model to the West Coast. He connected the 8 defecting Shockley scientists with Sherman Fairchild, who agreed to provide the high-risk funding they needed. The Traitorous Eight officially incorporated Fairchild Semiconductor. For the first time, independent scientists possessed the high-risk capital required to own and control their own technological breakthroughs. Fairchild Semiconductor immediately succeeded in pioneering the mass production of the integrated circuit, reducing computers from the size of entire rooms down to desktop devices. But the most important output of the company was psychological. The founders had already successfully rebelled against William Shockley. Now, as Fairchild grew bureaucratic, they realized they did not have to remain tied to this new parent company indefinitely either. Soon, the founders and their top employees began to splinter off. They took their equity, their technical expertise, and their venture capital connections and walked out the door to start entirely new ventures. While the company grew based on silicon, its most lasting legacy was the cultural template of the corporate spin-off. Over the following decade, Fairchild fractured into dozens of new companies. This sprawling web of startups is known as the Fair Children. Two of the original Traitorous Eight, Gordon Moore and Robert Noyce, executed the most famous spin-off, establishing a new node in this network, Intel. Intel utilized independent risk capital to commercialize the microprocessor, packing processing power onto a single chip that would eventually power the personal computing boom. The region traded the rigid, vertical ladder of mid-century monopolies for a liquid web of competing, interconnected startups. Stanford's continuous pipeline of fresh engineering brainpower kept this venture-backed spin-off machine running, allowing engineers to execute breakthroughs like the computer mouse and hypertext. This fluid exchange of talent directly enabled the development of modern personal computing, complete with graphical interfaces and local networking, at places like Xerox PARC. Because engineers can secure funding to leave and start their own firms, the modern tech ecosystem actively prevents good ideas from dying under bad management. The infrastructure is built to support immediate defection. Silicon Valley's global dominance is the result of institutionalizing rebellion. The region created a financial and cultural machine that actively embraces risk, tolerates failure, and depends entirely on the constant fracturing of companies to survive.